Larry Shrode, a man who survived the Vietnam conflict, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, had a humble beginning, modest family life, and experienced a horrifying journey that tested both his wits and his conscience. This is the story of how Vietnam defined a man, soldier, father, and human being, and how the events of the late 1960s made Larry Shrode who he is today. Down a short dirt road off U.S. Highway 10 in Delano, Minnesota, rests a self-built house mortared by a self-built man. Born into a poor agrarian family who lived only a quarter mile from his current home, Larry quickly learned the meaning of hard work. Countless hours were spent on the farm, either milking a few cows the family had, or tending to the fields of soybean and corn. Growing up in such dire straits, Larry missed out on many of the opportunities other young people his age indulged in. Sports, movies, music, girls. There was always something to do at home, so I rarely left, he said. Larry embodied the Protestant work ethic and worked dutifully as prescribed by his strong faith in God, a faith he would later abandon. Larry spent much of his teen years not only working on the farm but aiding neighbors with odd jobs for extra money. One of those neighbors, Walter Sletton, commissioned the young Shrode boy to help work on the addition of his home in March 1966. Walter had a young daughter, only a few years younger than Larry, who took an immediate interest in the boy. He was cute and strong. My dad liked him. I was in love. As was more the norm of the time than recent years, after a very short period of dating, the young couple were engaged in February 1967 and married shortly after in June of that same year. In September of 1967, Larry received a letter while training at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. His wife was pregnant with their first child. After enlisting, a mere 2 months after his wedding, in August of 1967, Larry excelled in basic training. I scored well in all my exercises, marksmanship, physical training. Larry completed his 8 weeks of basic training, and in March of 1968, he was on his way to Saigon, Vietnam for deployment. We were nervous, anxious, and scared. My unit, the 4th Infantry Division, had just gone through a devastating loss, and we were going to be replacing many of the killed and wounded. The loss, now Corporal Shrode was referring to, was the Bloody Tet Offensive, between January and February of 1968, only weeks before he arrived in country. I had a tough time adjusting, he said, to a new life of ration food, sleepless nights, and daily ambushes. Thus is the life of an Army patrolman in Vietnam. During the next year of his tour, Larry was involved in daily patrols, which involved numerous encounters with enemy Viet Cong insurgents, Vietnamese civilians, as well as other Army and Marine units. Every new day brought new dangers and close encounters with death and/or serious injury. No one, not even the officers, knew what we were doing, he says. A thought that many veterans shared regarding the lack of clear goals throughout the conflict. Vietnam was a series of frustrations and horror for the young soldier. On a particular patrol, Corporal Shrode was ordered as point for the entire platoon while trudging through the high point of a valley, somewhere in the dense jungle in the central part of the country. There was a series of whiz sounds like you hear in the Batman TV show that I heard on my left, he said. And when Corporal Shrode looked back, he saw that Sergeant John Sundersgaard, another Minnesota native, was lying still on the jungle floor. Platoon leader, First Lieutenant Hooper, gave the orders to hit the deck. And that's when we heard the AK fire. With no clear direction of where the fire came from, Corporal Shrode aimed his weapon in the direction of the whizzes and began firing into the tree line. The rest of the platoon returned fire under Larry's lead, and soon after the enemy fire ceased and the platoon regrouped to count the dead and see to the wounded. Sergeant Sundergaard was killed instantly with a round in the head. 6 others were killed from various wounds. 13 were wounded, and the melee was less than 3 minutes long. So much death in such little time gives you one of two attitudes. Life is a fragile thing to be cherished, or life is as meaningless and expendable as we are, Shrode said. Corporal Shrode, dragging the dead platoon sergeant to the helicopter evacuation point, felt as many of his fellow soldiers did, the latter of the two. The now Sergeant Shrode was appointed 2nd Squad Leader sometime shortly after this melee, and sent back out on patrol. I was counting the days at this point, almost home. The sergeant began using alcohol, at a habitual and destructive level. This, however, did not affect his battlefield performance, as he continued to be a favored and reliable squad leader to his lieutenant, who in December of 1968 recommended Larry for promotion to staff sergeant. Lieutenant Hooper's recommendation came as a surprise to the growingly apathetic Shrode, but when he received orders of transfer back to Tan Su Nut Air Base near Saigon for a garrison post, he realized that the young platoon officer had done him a favor. There were no more 4-day-long patrols, dead, dying, wounded friends, or whizzing bullets to deal with, but the sleepless nights and alcoholism weren't as easy to transfer away from. Staff Sergeant Shrode spent the rest of his tour of duty on base and never saw another day of bloodshed. When Staff Sergeant Shrode returned home to an infant child and loving wife, he abandoned the alcohol abuse he indulged in while in Vietnam. His experiences also led him to abandon his Lutheran faith, which conflicted with the beliefs of his wife, who didn't seem to understand that God wasn't there for me, he said. They eventually reconciled and now spend Sundays together doing volunteer work for the community rather than going to church. You know, there are still nights where I wake up and realize how lucky I wasn't 10 steps behind on that day that Sundersgaard was killed. And you know what? That's life. You get lucky, and sometimes luck gets you, Shrode exclaimed. When Larry finally returned home, he showed that even a man in the face of gross horror can still be the same man when he returns home.
City center, 9 p.m. Just like